Hi, I'm Emily Parker, and I never expected a simple birthday dinner to turn into a nightmare. My brother mocked my gift in front of everyone, making me feel embarrassed and powerless. But then Mom said something that stopped me in my tracks, and what happened next completely changed everything I thought I knew about my family. I spent 3 weeks planning Dad's 70th birthday dinner, calling his favorite restaurant, coordinating with Mom about the guest list, and carefully choosing his gift. I wanted everything to be perfect because these family moments felt increasingly precious. Dad had been quieter lately, more reflective, and I sensed this birthday meant something deeper to him than usual. The restaurant buzzed with the comfortable chaos of a Saturday evening, and our table by the window felt warm and intimate. Mom had worn her blue dress, the one Dad always said brought out her eyes, and she kept reaching over to touch his hand. My brother Jake arrived 20 minutes late, as usual, sliding into his chair with that easy confidence he'd carried since childhood. I waited until after dinner to present my gift, wanting the moment to feel special and unhurried. Inside the carefully wrapped box was a vintage compass I'd found at an antique shop, engraved with coordinates of our old family cabin. Dad had taught me to read maps there, showing me how to find true north when everything else felt uncertain and confusing. Jake barely glanced at the compass before laughing, that sharp sound that always made my stomach tighten with old familiar dread. Seriously, Em? A broken compass for someone who never leaves the house? I mean, where's he gonna go with that thing? His words cut through the restaurant's gentle hum, and I felt heat creep up my neck as other diners turned to look. I tried to explain the significance, how the coordinates pointed to our happiest family memories, but Jake's smirk only deepened with each word I spoke. You always were sentimental about the weirdest stuff, he said, already losing interest and turning back to his phone. The compass suddenly felt heavy and foolish in my hands, like a child's misguided attempt at meaningfulness. Mom's voice cut through my embarrassment like a blade through silk. Jake, that's enough. There was something in her tone I'd never heard before, a steel edge that made my brother actually look up from his screen. Dad set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, and I noticed his hands trembling slightly, though I couldn't tell if it was age or emotion. Your sister put thought into that gift, Mom continued, her words measured but carrying an undercurrent of something bigger brewing beneath the surface. More thought than you've put into this family in years, especially considering what you've been hiding from all of us. The air at our table suddenly felt charged, like the moments before a summer thunderstorm breaks open the sky. Jake's face went pale, and for the first time in years, I saw uncertainty flicker across his features like a candle in the wind. What are you talking about, Mom? He asked, but his voice had lost its usual cockiness, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. I found myself leaning forward, sensing that whatever came next would change everything between us. Mom reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder I hadn't noticed her carrying, her movements deliberate and controlled. I'm talking about the trust fund your grandfather left for Emily's education, the one you convinced your father to let you manage 10 years ago. Her words hit the table like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples I could feel but not yet understand. My mind struggled to process what she'd just said, like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing from the box. What trust fund? I whispered, my voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. I looked between my parents and Jake, searching their faces for some explanation that would make sense of this moment that felt completely surreal. Jake's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, reminding me of a fish gasping for air. All his usual smooth confidence evaporated into the warm restaurant air. Dad's eyes were fixed on his hands, folded carefully in his lap, and I realized he'd known about this conversation coming tonight. The weight of their shared secret pressed down on our table like a heavy blanket. $43,000, Mom said quietly, sliding papers across the white tablecloth toward me with steady fingers. That's what your grandfather left specifically for your college education, Emily. Jake promised he'd invest it safely, help it grow for your future. Her voice carried a sadness that seemed to age her before my eyes, and I wondered how long she'd been carrying this knowledge. I stared at the bank statements, watching numbers blur as my eyes filled with tears I didn't want to shed in public. While I'd worked 2 jobs through college, taking out loans that still haunted my monthly budget, this money had been sitting somewhere, meant for me. The irony felt bitter and sharp, like swallowing broken glass with each breath I took. Jake finally found his voice, stammering excuses about market volatility and poor timing, his hands gesturing helplessly in the air between us. I was going to pay it back, I swear. The business just hit some rough patches, and I thought. His words trailed off as he seemed to realize how hollow they sounded, how little they could possibly matter now. The business he'd started with money that belonged to me, the new car he'd bought last spring, the vacation photos he'd posted from Europe, suddenly everything about Jake's life looked different through this new lens. I felt something shift inside my chest, a door closing on the sisterly trust I'd carried for 34 years, even through all his casual cruelties and thoughtless moments. Dad finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with what sounded like years of guilt and regret. "We found out last month when Mom was organizing our finances for retirement. I thought Jake had been sending you reports, keeping you informed." His admission hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to breathe around. The restaurant continued its evening rhythm around us, couples sharing dessert, families celebrating birthdays, while our table sat in the eye of a storm that had been building for a decade. I thought about all the times I'd felt like the family failure, the one who couldn't quite get ahead, while Jake seemed to float through life with effortless success and Dad's obvious pride. Mom reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, her touch warm but somehow desperate, like she was trying to bridge a chasm that had suddenly opened between us all. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. We trusted him because he's family, and sometimes that trust blinds us to what we should have seen." Her words carried the weight of maternal guilt and protective love. I pulled my hand away gently, needing space to process this revelation that felt like learning I'd been living someone else's life all along. The compass sat between us on the table, its antique brass catching the restaurant's soft light, and I wondered if Dad understood now why I'd chosen coordinates that pointed toward simpler times, when our family's true north had felt clear and unwavering. Looking around the table at these three people who'd shaped my entire world, I felt something new stirring beneath the hurt and betrayal, a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the little sister scrambling to catch up or prove herself worthy of their attention and respect. I was a woman who'd built her life honestly, and maybe it was time to start acting like it. The drive home felt endless, even though Mom and Dad's house was only 15 minutes from the restaurant where my world had just cracked open. I followed their car through familiar neighborhoods, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to make sense of everything that had been said and left unsaid. The compass sat in the passenger seat beside me, somehow feeling heavier now than when I'd first bought it. Inside their living room, the same space where I'd grown up believing in fairness and family loyalty, we settled into an uncomfortable silence. Dad sank into his old recliner, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, while Mom bustled around making coffee nobody wanted. Jake sat on the edge of the sofa, his confident posture finally cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. I found myself studying this room with new eyes, noticing things I'd never questioned before, the expensive art on the walls, the renovated kitchen visible through the doorway, improvements that had appeared gradually over the past few years. How much of this house was paid for with my money? The question slipped out before I could stop myself, sharper than I'd intended. Mom's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with shaking hands, the small sound echoing unnaturally loud. "Emily, sweetheart, your father and I never touched a penny of that money. We had no idea Jake wasn't sending you the reports, wasn't keeping you informed about the investments." Her voice carried a mother's desperate need to be believed, to somehow remain innocent in her daughter's eyes. Jake finally looked directly at me for the first time since Mom's revelation, his face a map of guilt and something that might have been shame. "I never meant for it to go this far, Em. It was supposed to be short-term, just until my software company got off the ground. I thought I could triple the money for you, make it into something really substantial." His explanations sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing them for months. The software company I'd never fully understood, the one that supposedly developed apps for small businesses, suddenly made perfect sense in the cruelest way possible. "So my grandfather's gift to me became your startup capital," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My education fund became your entrepreneurial dream, and I was never supposed to know because you'd pay me back before I needed it." Dad's voice cracked when he finally spoke, each word seeming to cost him enormous effort and pain. "Jake told us you'd decided not to pursue graduate school, that you were happy with your bachelor's degree and your job. We thought the money was just growing for your future, maybe a house down payment or wedding fund." The betrayal was layered, I realized, Jake lying to them as thoroughly as he'd lied to me. I thought about all the graduate programs I'd researched but never applied to, telling myself I couldn't afford the risk of more debt. The journalism master's degree I'd dreamed about, the photography workshops in Italy, the writing retreats that might have changed everything about my career path. Jake hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen possibilities, dreams I'd buried because I thought they were financially impossible. "Show me everything," I said, my voice carrying authority I'd never heard from myself before, not even in my most confident professional moments. "I want to see every bank statement, every investment record, every transaction. I want to know exactly where my grandfather's money went and when." The papers Mom had shown me at the restaurant were just the beginning, I realized, the tip of an iceberg I needed to fully understand. Mom disappeared into Dad's study and returned with a thick folder, her movements careful and deliberate, like she was handling something fragile and dangerous. The documents inside painted a picture of systematic deception. Quarterly reports Jake had supposedly sent me but never did, investment statements showing steady growth followed by mysterious withdrawals, a complex web of financial manipulation that had taken years to build. As I read through the paperwork, Jake began talking faster, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. "The market crashed right after I made some big moves, and then there were business expenses, legal fees for the LLC, equipment we needed to stay competitive. I kept thinking the next quarter would be better, that I'd be able to restore everything before you ever needed to know." But his words felt empty now, like hearing a song played in a minor key when you'd always known it as happy and bright. I could see through his explanations to the choices underneath, the deliberate decision to use my money for his risks, the calculated deception that had lasted 10 years, the assumption that I was too trusting or too naive to ever demand accountability. "You bought a Tesla last year," I said quietly, remembering how proud he'd been showing it off at Mom's birthday dinner, how he'd insisted on driving us all around the block to experience the acceleration. $60,000 for a car, while I've been driving the same Honda since college because I couldn't afford payments on anything newer. The contrast felt almost absurd in its cruelty. Jake's face flushed red, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to get caught stealing cookies before dinner, except now the stakes were my entire financial future. "I needed reliable transportation for client meetings, Emily. Image matters in business, and that car was essentially a marketing investment." Even he seemed to realize how hollow that justification sounded in the heavy silence that followed. Dad stood up abruptly, his movements sharp with an anger I rarely saw from him, his usual gentle demeanor cracking like ice in spring. "Enough, Jake. Just stop talking and let your sister process this. You've said enough lies for 1 decade. The disappointment in his voice was devastating to witness, a father's love curdling into something harder and more painful to bear. I found myself thinking about Christmas mornings throughout our childhood, how Jake always seemed to get slightly better gifts, how his college expenses were never discussed while mine were carefully budgeted and planned. I'd attributed it to birth order, to parents learning to be more generous with experience, but now I wondered what other financial secrets had shaped the dynamics I'd accepted as normal. The room felt smaller with each revelation, like the walls were closing in around family secrets that had been hiding in plain sight. "I need to understand why nobody thought to check on this sooner," I said, looking between my parents with a mixture of love and bewilderment. 10 years, and nobody thought it was strange that I never mentioned investment returns or asked questions about my trust fund. Mom's eyes filled with tears that threatened to spill over, her maternal guilt visible in every line of her face. "We trusted Jake completely, and honestly, Emily, you've always been so independent, so private about your finances. When you never brought up the trust, we assumed you were just letting it grow quietly, being responsible about long-term planning." Her explanation made sense in the cruelest way possible. The irony was sharp enough to cut. My independence, the very quality my parents had always praised, had become the perfect cover for Jake's deception. My refusal to ask for help, my determination to make my own way in the world, had made it easy for my family to assume I was thriving when I was actually struggling to survive on my own merit alone. Jake slumped further into the sofa, his earlier defensiveness replaced by something that looked almost like genuine remorse, though I found myself unable to trust even that. "I know I messed up, Em. I know sorry doesn't fix anything. But the business is finally starting to turn around, and I can set up a payment plan, maybe have everything restored within 5 years. 5 years, as if time could somehow erase the decade of lies and lost opportunities. 5 years, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words, thinking about how old I'd be then, how different my life might have been if I'd had access to that money when I actually needed it. "I'll be almost 40, Jake. The time when that money could have changed the trajectory of my entire career will be gone forever. The permanence of some kinds of theft was just beginning to settle into my bones. Looking around at my family, Dad avoiding eye contact, Mom crying quietly into her coffee, Jake staring at his hands like they held answers he'd lost years ago, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of who we all were. The compass in my purse seemed to mock me now. I'd given Dad a tool for finding direction while my own true north had been stolen and hidden from me. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady but my resolve surprisingly firm, feeling like I was stepping out of one version of my life and into another. I need time to think about all of this, I said, my voice calm despite the chaos swirling in my chest. I need to figure out what comes next, legally and emotionally, and I can't do that while sitting in this room with all of you watching me process 10 years of betrayal. As I walked toward the door, Mom called my name with a desperation that broke my heart, but I couldn't turn around yet, couldn't offer comfort when I was still learning the full scope of what had been taken from me. The evening air felt sharp and clean after the suffocating weight of family secrets, and I wondered if this was what it felt like to finally grow up, even when you thought you already had. Sitting in my car in their driveway, I pulled out my phone and stared at the contact information for the lawyer who'd helped me with my apartment lease, wondering if she handled family financial disputes. The thought of taking legal action against my own brother felt surreal and necessary in equal measure, like surgery that would hurt but might save something vital before it was too late to recover. The drive home stretched ahead of me like an unmapped territory, and for the first time in my adult life, I had no idea what kind of person I was going to choose to become. The only thing I knew for certain was that the Emily who had walked into that restaurant tonight was not the same woman who would wake up tomorrow morning, and maybe that transformation was long overdue. I drove home on autopilot, my mind replaying 10 years of conversations with Jake that now felt like elaborate performances designed to keep me from asking the right questions. Every family gathering where he'd casually mentioned his business success, every time he'd picked up a dinner check with flourishes that seemed generous but now felt grotesque, every moment I'd felt proud of my big brother's achievements that were built on my stolen foundation. My apartment had never felt smaller than it did that night, the walls seeming to press in with the weight of everything I was finally understanding. I'd always been proud of this space, proud that I'd furnished it entirely on my own, that every piece reflected my taste and my hard work. Now I wondered what it might have looked like if I'd had the financial freedom to choose based on dreams rather than discount prices. Sleep felt impossible, so I made tea and sat at my kitchen table with the papers Mom had given me, spreading them across the surface like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that revealed a picture I didn't want to see. The numbers told a story of systematic theft disguised as family trust, and each bank statement felt like reading diary entries from a life I'd unknowingly lived in financial chains. At 2 a.m, I found myself Googling trust fund theft family legal options, my laptop screen harsh in the dark apartment. The search results painted a grim picture of family legal battles, stories of siblings destroying relationships over money, warnings about the emotional cost of pursuing justice when the perpetrator shared your last name. But mixed with the warnings were success stories, people who'd fought back and recovered what was rightfully theirs. The law office website looked professional and reassuring in that sterile way that expensive help often does, and I found myself reading attorney bios like I was researching surgeons for a life-saving operation. Margaret Chen specialized in financial fraud and family law, her photo showing a woman about my age with kind eyes and a firm expression that suggested she understood the delicate balance between justice and family preservation. I drafted an email to her office 3 different times, each version trying to capture the complexity of my situation without sounding either naive or vindictive. How do you explain that you need legal help against your own brother without making your entire family sound dysfunctional? How do you describe a decade of financial manipulation that happened with your parents' unknowing cooperation and your own trusting ignorance? By morning, my kitchen table looked like a detective's evidence board, papers organized into piles that told the story of my stolen education fund. I'd found patterns I'd missed the night before, withdrawals that coincided with Jake's major purchases, investment losses that seemed suspiciously timed with his business expansions, a systematic emptying of my grandfather's gift that had taken years of careful planning to conceal. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Sweetheart, I know you need space, but please know how sorry we are. Dad and I love you so much, and we're going to make this right somehow." The message felt like a bandage over a wound that needed surgery, well-intentioned but inadequate for the scope of damage that had been done to our family's foundation. I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years, unable to imagine sitting through marketing meetings and client presentations while my entire understanding of my family's financial ethics crumbled around me. My boss sounded concerned when I called, and I realized how strange it must seem for Emily Parker, reliable and never absent Emily, to need a personal day with such short notice. Margaret Chen's assistant could fit me in that afternoon, her voice professionally sympathetic when I briefly explained the nature of my legal consultation. Family financial disputes are complex, she said gently, but Miss Chen has helped many clients navigate these situations. Please bring any documentation you have, and try not to worry too much before you've spoken with her. Her kindness felt like a small mercy in a world that had suddenly revealed its capacity for deception. Sitting in the law office waiting room, I felt like I was crossing a line I'd never be able to uncross, moving from family loyalty into family litigation territory. The magazines on the coffee table were all business publications, their covers promising insights into success and wealth management that felt mockingly irrelevant to my situation. I was here because my family's wealth management had consisted of letting one brother rob another sibling blind for a decade. Margaret Chen was smaller than her photo suggested but carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made me immediately trust her judgment. Her handshake was firm, her expression serious but not unkind, and she listened to my story without interruption while taking notes in precise handwriting. When I finished, she sat back in her leather chair and studied me with eyes that had clearly heard this story before in different variations. "The good news," she said, her voice measured and professional, "is that you have an excellent case for recovery. Trust fund theft is taken very seriously by the courts, and the documentation you've brought shows clear evidence of breach of fiduciary duty. The challenging news is that pursuing this legally will likely damage your family relationships permanently, and that's a cost only you can decide whether you're willing to pay." Her honesty felt both refreshing and terrifying, like having a doctor explain a necessary but risky surgery that could save your life but change everything about how you'd have to live it. "What would the process look like?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "How long would it take to recover the money? And what are the chances Jake could claim legitimate business losses to avoid repayment?" Given the clear documentation and the fact that he never had legal authority to use trust funds for business investments, I'd estimate an 80% chance of full recovery within 18 months, she explained. Her fingers steepled as she calculated timelines and probabilities. "However, he'll likely be required to pay legal fees and possibly punitive damages, which could force him into bankruptcy if his business isn't as successful as he's claimed." The thought of Jake losing everything felt both satisfying and nauseating, justice and cruelty wrapped together in a way that made my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "Is there any way to pursue this that might preserve some relationship with my family?" The question felt naive even as I asked it, like asking if surgery could be performed without making any cuts. "Some families do survive these kinds of legal actions," Margaret said carefully, "but usually only when the perpetrator takes full responsibility and the family members rally around the victim. From what you've described, your parents seem supportive, but your brother's response to accountability will determine whether your family can heal or whether this will create permanent divisions that litigation will only make deeper." I thought about Jake's desperate explanations the night before, his attempts to justify what couldn't be justified, his assumption that 5 more years of my patience would somehow make everything acceptable. "He doesn't think he did anything wrong," I said slowly, the realization settling like a stone in my stomach. "He still sees this as a business investment gone bad rather than theft of my inheritance." Margaret nodded with the weary understanding of someone who'd watched families destroy themselves over money countless times before. "That attitude is actually helpful for your case, because it shows he doesn't understand the legal severity of his actions. If he's been casual about this theft, he's probably been casual about documentation, which means we'll likely find even more evidence than what you've already discovered today." Walking out of the law office, I felt like I was carrying a loaded weapon I wasn't sure I wanted to use but knew I might have to. The afternoon sun felt harsh after the soft lighting of Margaret's office, and I squinted as I tried to process the choice ahead of me: pursue justice and potentially destroy my family, or let Jake's theft stand and live with that injustice forever poisoning every family gathering. My phone had 3 missed calls from Jake, each voicemail more desperate than the last, his voice cycling through anger, bargaining, and something that might have been genuine panic. "Please call me back. We can figure this out without lawyers, I promise." I know you're upset, but this doesn't have to become some big legal thing. We're family, remember? We can work through this together like we always have. But listening to his messages, I realized we'd never actually worked through anything together as equals. I'd always been the little sister who accepted his explanations and trusted his judgment. The dynamic he wanted to preserve was the same one that had made his theft possible in the first place, and maybe it was time to discover what kind of relationship we might have as adults who held each other accountable for their choices. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Margaret Chen's business card in one hand and my phone in the other, knowing that my next decision would determine not just my financial future but the entire trajectory of my family relationships. The compass from Dad's birthday sat on my coffee table, its brass surface reflecting the lamplight, and I wondered if finding true north sometimes meant accepting that the path forward would be completely different from the one you'd been traveling. The silence in my apartment felt pregnant with possibility and loss in equal measure, and I realized that growing up sometimes meant choosing justice over peace, accountability over harmony, even when the cost felt almost too heavy to bear. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether to remain the trusting little sister who kept family secrets or become the woman who demanded that family loyalty flow both ways, even if it meant walking through fire to find out who I really was. I woke up the next morning with Margaret Chen's business card still clutched in my hand, the sharp edges having pressed themselves into my palm while I slept fitfully through dreams of courtrooms and family dinners that turned into interrogations. The morning light streaming through my bedroom window felt different somehow, like I was seeing my life through new eyes that couldn't unsee what they'd learned about trust and betrayal within families. My coffee tasted bitter, though I'd made it the same way I had every morning for 3 years, and I found myself staring at my kitchen table where the evidence of Jake's deception still lay scattered like fragments of a life I was only beginning to understand. Each bank statement felt like reading someone else's mail, discovering a parallel version of my existence where I'd had choices and opportunities that had been stolen before I'd even known they existed. At work, I moved through my morning meetings like an actor playing a role I'd forgotten I was supposed to perform, my mind constantly drifting to Margaret's words about permanent family damage and 18-month legal timelines. My colleague Sarah asked if I was feeling okay, her concern genuine but impossible to address without explaining that I was discovering my entire family's financial foundation had been built on lies I'd unknowingly supported. During my lunch break, I drove to the park where Jake and I had played as children, needing to sit somewhere that held memories of us as siblings before money and deception had poisoned the well of our relationship. The playground looked smaller than I remembered, the swings where we'd competed to see who could jump farthest now seeming fragile and innocent, relics from a time when our biggest conflicts involved sharing toys rather than stolen trust funds. My phone rang while I was sitting on a bench watching other people's children play with the kind of carefree abandon I wasn't sure I'd ever feel again. Jake's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me needed to hear what he'd say now that he'd had time to process the magnitude of what he'd done to our family's foundation. "Emily, thank God you answered." His voice rushed through the phone with a desperation I'd never heard from him before, the confident big brother persona completely stripped away to reveal something raw and frightened underneath. "I've been up all night thinking about this, and I have a plan that could work for everyone. We don't need lawyers or courts or any of that formal stuff that'll just make everything worse." His plan, as he outlined it with the same enthusiasm he'd once used to describe his business ventures, involved him taking out a personal loan to restore the principal amount immediately, plus interest calculated at market rates for the past 10 years. "I can have the money in your account within 2 weeks, he promised, his words tumbling over each other like he was afraid I'd hang up before he finished selling me on his solution. But listening to him negotiate with my stolen inheritance like it was a business deal he was trying to close, I felt something harden in my chest that I'd never experienced before. "Jake, you're talking about my grandfather's gift to me like it's a debt you owe to a bank," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This wasn't just money you borrowed, this was my future you spent without asking, my education you traded for your entrepreneurial dreams." The silence that followed stretched between us like a chasm filled with 10 years of assumptions I'd made about my brother's character and integrity. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a note of irritation that reminded me of the little boy who'd gotten angry when caught breaking rules rather than sorry for breaking them in the first place. "I get that you're upset, Em, I really do, but you have to understand the pressure I was under," he said, shifting into the defensive tone that had always made me feel like I was being unreasonable for having feelings about his actions. Dad kept talking about how proud he was of my business success, and Mom was telling everyone about her entrepreneur son, and I couldn't let them down by admitting I was failing. For the first time, I could hear the trap he'd built for himself, using our parents' pride to justify stealing from their daughter, creating a web of deception that had required more lies each year to maintain. But understanding the psychology behind his theft didn't make me feel more forgiving. It made me realize how calculated his choices had been, how many opportunities he'd had to come clean and chose deception instead. So you let me struggle through college working 2 jobs while you played successful businessman with my money, I said, my anger finally finding its voice after years of accepting his explanations for everything. You let me take out student loans that I'm still paying off while you used my inheritance to fund the lifestyle that made our parents so proud of their successful son. Jake's breathing was audible through the phone, and I could picture him running his hands through his hair the way he'd done since childhood when adults asked him difficult questions. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Emily. The business was going to be huge, and I was going to surprise you with way more money than Grandpa left. I was trying to help you by making it grow into something substantial. But his intentions felt irrelevant now, like claiming you meant to help someone while you were actively harming them, and I realized that Jake's version of helping had always involved him making decisions for me without consulting me. You were trying to help yourself, I said quietly, the truth settling between us like a stone dropping into still water. And when your help failed, you decided I should pay the cost of your good intentions. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Margaret Chen's office, my hands shaking as I dialed but my voice steady when her assistant answered. I'd like to schedule another appointment with Ms. Chen, I said, the words feeling both foreign and absolutely right in my mouth. I've decided to pursue legal action for recovery of my trust fund. The appointment was set for the following morning, and driving back to work, I felt like I was crossing a bridge that was burning behind me as I walked, cutting off retreat routes to the family dynamics that had shaped my entire adult life. There would be no going back to the version of Emily who trusted without question, who accepted explanations without demanding evidence, who prioritized family harmony over personal justice. That evening, I called my parents to tell them about my decision, my heart pounding as I waited for Dad to pick up the phone. Hi, sweetheart, his voice sounded aged and fragile, like the revelations of the past few days had physically diminished him. Your mother and I have been talking, and we want you to know that whatever you decide to do about Jake, we'll support you completely. Mom took the phone from Dad, her voice thick with emotion and what sounded like maternal guilt she'd been carrying since our dinner at the restaurant. We failed you, Emily, and we're so sorry. We should have been checking on that trust fund ourselves, should have been protecting your interests instead of just trusting Jake to do the right thing. If you need to take legal action to get your money back, we understand completely. Their support felt both comforting and heartbreaking, like receiving absolution I'd never asked for but desperately needed, and I realized that my parents' love had never been conditional on maintaining family peace at any cost. It's going to be messy, I warned them, thinking about court proceedings and depositions and all the ways legal action could poison family gatherings for years to come. Jake won't forgive this, and holidays might never be the same. Holidays haven't been the same since we found out what he did to you, Dad said firmly, his voice carrying a strength I hadn't heard since the restaurant. Your mother and I have been married for 42 years, and we've learned that real family love sometimes means holding people accountable for their choices, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling simultaneously more alone and more supported than I'd ever felt in my adult life. The compass from Dad's birthday caught the evening light from my coffee table, its brass surface gleaming like a promise that finding true north was possible even when the terrain ahead looked completely unfamiliar and potentially treacherous. I opened my laptop and began drafting a list of questions for Margaret Chen, practical concerns about timelines and legal strategies mixed with deeper questions about how to navigate a lawsuit against family while preserving whatever relationships might survive the process. For the first time in days, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than just reacting to revelations, actively choosing my path rather than letting family dynamics choose it for me. The next morning would bring another step into unknown territory, but tonight I felt surprisingly calm, like a woman who'd finally stopped apologizing for wanting what was rightfully hers. The Emily who'd walked into that birthday dinner would have found a way to forgive Jake's theft to keep the family peace, but the woman I was becoming understood that some kinds of peace were too expensive to afford. Looking around my small apartment, I tried to imagine what my life might have looked like with $43,000 available for graduate school, for photography equipment, for the writing retreat in Tuscany I'd bookmarked but never seriously considered. Those opportunities were gone forever, but maybe it wasn't too late to create new possibilities with money that could finally be returned to its rightful owner and used for dreams I was just beginning to allow myself to consider. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not empty but expectant, like the pause before a symphony begins or the moment before diving into water you've never tested. Tomorrow I would take another step toward becoming someone I'd never been before, a woman who demanded accountability even from the people she loved most, even when that demand might change everything about how we loved each other. 18 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, sunlight streaming through windows that faced east instead of the dim courtyard view I'd grown accustomed to believing I deserved. The settlement had been finalized 3 weeks ago, and Jake's business had somehow survived the judgment, though our relationship hadn't weathered the legal process quite as successfully. The $47,000 in my account represented more than recovered money. It was recovered dignity, recovered possibilities. Margaret Chin had been right about the timeline and the family cost, both predictions proving accurate in ways that felt both satisfying and heartbreaking. Jake had fought the lawsuit for 6 months before his own attorney convinced him that denial wasn't a viable legal strategy when faced with 10 years of documented financial deception. His anger during the depositions had revealed a side of him I'd never seen, someone who genuinely believed his intentions justified his actions. The final settlement included interest and legal fees, but more importantly, it included Jake's written acknowledgement that he had violated his fiduciary duty and stolen money intended for my education. Seeing those words in legal documents felt like having an official record of what I'd always suspected but been too loyal to acknowledge, that my brother's love had always been conditional on my willingness to accept whatever treatment he offered. Mom and Dad had attended every court proceeding, sitting quietly in the gallery like witnesses to the dissolution of family myths they'd spent decades building. Dad aged visibly during those months, the stress of watching his children battle in court taking a toll that went beyond the financial implications. But he never asked me to drop the case, never suggested that family peace was more valuable than justice. Our relationship had actually grown stronger through the legal process, built on a foundation of honesty that hadn't existed when family loyalty meant protecting secrets. Mom started calling me every Sunday, conversations that meandered through topics we'd never discussed before. Her own regrets about trusting without verifying, her pride in my courage to stand up for myself, her sadness about the brother she thought she'd raised versus the man Jake had revealed himself to be. Jake and I hadn't spoken since the settlement conference where he'd signed the agreement with barely controlled fury, his jaw tight as he wrote the check that restored my stolen inheritance. His wife had reached out once, suggesting that family holidays might eventually return to normal if we all just agreed to move forward. But her email felt like a request to pretend the theft had never happened rather than an acknowledgement that healing required accountability. The money had opened doors I'd forgotten I'd once dreamed of walking through, possibilities that felt both exciting and overwhelming after years of financial constraint. I'd enrolled in a graduate photography program that started in the fall, finally pursuing the artistic education I'd abandoned when I thought I couldn't afford to chase dreams that didn't guarantee steady employment. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jake's theft had ultimately led me to discover exactly what I wanted to do with the financial freedom my grandfather had intended. Work felt different now that it was a choice rather than a necessity driven by desperation, and I'd given my notice to pursue freelance photography while attending graduate school. My boss had been surprisingly supportive, offering to hire me for contract work that would provide steady income without the emotional drain of pretending my family drama hadn't fundamentally changed my perspective on loyalty, trust, and the price of keeping other people's secrets. The compass from Dad's birthday sat on my new mantelpiece, its antique brass polished to a shine that caught morning light streaming through my east-facing windows. He'd asked me to keep it despite everything, saying it represented something important about finding direction even when the familiar landmarks disappeared. Sometimes true north requires us to walk away from the paths we thought we were supposed to follow, he'd said quietly. Sarah from work had helped me move to the new apartment, her practical support meaning more than she probably realized during a time when my social circle felt complicated by family litigation. "You seem different," she'd observed while we unpacked boxes in the larger bedroom I could finally afford. Sadder in some ways, but stronger too, like you've been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. Her observation felt accurate in ways I was still discovering. The relief of no longer protecting Jake's secrets mixing with grief for the brother I'd thought I'd had and the family dynamic I'd believed was built on mutual respect rather than exploitation disguised as love. Growing up, I realized, sometimes meant accepting that the people you'd idealized were capable of disappointing you in ways that changed the fundamental nature of your relationship with them. The legal victory had been complete, but the emotional resolution was more complex, layered with satisfaction, sadness, and a newfound understanding of my own capacity for self-advocacy. I'd learned that standing up for yourself sometimes meant standing alone, that justice didn't always restore relationships, and that protecting yourself from further harm was sometimes more important than preserving family harmony at any cost. My photography had evolved during the months of legal proceedings, my eye drawn to images of resilience and transformation rather than the safe landscapes I'd always favored. The portfolio I was building for graduate school applications included a series called After, portraits of women who'd survived various betrayals and emerged with harder-won but more authentic versions of themselves. Each photograph told a story of someone who'd learned to trust their own judgment. Mom had framed one of those photographs, a self-portrait I'd taken on the day the settlement was finalized, and hung it in her living room where Jake's business awards used to be displayed. "You look like yourself in this picture," she'd said simply, and I'd understood she meant the self I'd always been underneath the layers of accommodation and family loyalty that had obscured my real personality for decades. The graduate program acceptance letter had arrived with financial aid information that I'd read with a mixture of excitement and irony, knowing that my grandfather's restored gift would cover tuition costs that other students would struggle to afford. His intention to provide educational opportunities was finally being honored, just 20 years later than originally planned, by a granddaughter who'd learned the difference between family love and family manipulation. Dating felt different now too, my standards shifted by the understanding that I deserved relationships built on honesty rather than convenience or familiar dynamics that felt comfortable but weren't actually healthy. The lawyer Margaret had introduced me to at a professional networking event had asked me out twice, and while I wasn't ready for anything serious, I appreciated his straightforward communication style and respect for the boundaries I was still learning to establish. Some evenings, I found myself thinking about Jake, wondering if he'd learned anything from the legal consequences of his choices or if he still saw himself as the victim of my unreasonable demand for accountability. Our mutual friends had stopped trying to facilitate reconciliation after the settlement, finally understanding that some relationships couldn't survive the truth about what they'd actually been based on all along. The apartment felt like a reflection of who I was becoming rather than who I'd thought I was supposed to be, furnished with pieces I'd chosen for beauty rather than practicality, walls painted colors that made me happy rather than neutral shades that wouldn't offend anyone. For the first time in my adult life, my living space felt like home rather than just shelter, a place where I could pursue dreams rather than just survive disappointments. Standing at my kitchen window on Sunday morning, coffee in hand and graduate school orientation materials spread across the counter, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete ownership of my life's direction. The path ahead was uncertain, built on dreams I was finally brave enough to pursue, funded by money that was rightfully mine, supported by family relationships based on truth rather than secrets. The woman who'd walked into that birthday dinner 18 months ago would barely recognize the person I'd become. Someone who'd learned that love without accountability wasn't actually love, that family loyalty couldn't be one-sided, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable someone's harmful behavior even when that refusal came with a price you'd spend years paying.